Do you know which one is the oldest absolute monarchy in the world? Yes, the Papal States, the Vatican. You see, the Pope is like a monarch. He has the absolute power. There are very, very few absolute monarchies still in existence in the world. Most monarchies are just for fun this day and age, to show off your king or queen. But Saudi Arabia, Vatican, and one or two other states is an absolute monarchy, where the king or the queen or the pope has total and absolute power to do what he or she wishes to do. And so it has been since 700s that Pope has had his very own papal state. It was a big chunk of Italy. If you can imagine the Italian peninsula that looks like a boot, right there in the middle, about a quarter of Italy was what we call the Papal State. Up north of it was Milan, Venice, and south was Sardinia and Sicily. Multiple small states before Italy became unified country. But in 1870, so not such a long time ago, Italian people have decided to unite as one sovereign state. They did not want to belong to multiple small city-states. So the movement for unification of Italy basically erased papal states from the map of the world. In 1870, as a matter of fact, papal state ceased to exist, not even in the Vatican. The Pope Pius IX proclaimed himself the prisoner of the Vatican, and he and his two successors refused to leave and put their feet outside the parameters of the St. Peter's Plaza in the Vatican. They did not recognize the validity of the Italian state. They claim that this was a robbery, that they still are the owners of the papal states. That happened in 1870. But 55 years later, and 3 popes later, Pius XI was missing the good old days so much of being the king of his own kingdom that he decided, you know what, if I cannot have my kingdom, at least I will have a feast day of Christ the King, to remind everyone that Christ is the King of Kings and Master of the universe. And because Christ is the King and I am Christ's vicar, I am the King as well. So in 1925, Pope Pius XI proclaims this new feast day, Christ the King Sunday. The political context is very important because at that point diplomatic negotiations were taking place between Pius XI and guess who? Benito Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Italy, the first fascist government in Europe. 1929, 4 years after Christ the King Sunday was proclaimed, a successful treaty is signed by Benito Mussolini and Pius XI. The treaty is called the Treaty of Lateran. In that treaty, Mussolini graciously agreed to create papal states again. within the Vatican City and a few small places outside. So it is thanks to Mussolini and the fascist government that the Vatican exists the way it exists today. It is thanks to that 1929 Lateran Treaty that Pope is once again the absolute monarch. Even more interestingly, 4 years later, 1933, the very same Pope Pius XI signs another treaty, this time with Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. And that treaty gives Catholic Church many privileges and legal protection in the Third Reich, again recognizing Vatican, the Pope, as the head of a sovereign state, an absolute monarch. You see, political context is very much present even in the religion. With that historical background, would you be surprised if I told you that Christ the King Sunday is not my favorite feast day? Really? Christ the King? I can't think of one single instance in the Gospel when Jesus would be pontificating on the throne and behaving like an absolute monarch. I have come not to be served, but to serve. I can't picture any king or queen or pope saying such a statement. Not to serve, not to be served, but to serve. And so that Christ the King Sunday is very much compensating Sunday for Pius XI. When you lose something, you find another way to feel better about yourself. And as Christians, we have to look at the text of the Gospels and ask ourselves, what does it mean when Jesus in the Gospels is talking about the kingdom of God? Is it really about the kingdom with the throne and the armies and taxes and off with your head? Is this the kind of kingdom that we talk when we proclaim the gospel, that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that falls on the ground? So the problem is usually with the language. You know by now, I hope, that the Gospels were all written in Greek. In that time, unfortunately, there was no longer Greek democracy. That ancient experiment with democracy ceased to exist several centuries before Christ. By the time of the 1st century, there are only kingdoms and empires around the Mediterranean Sea. The Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Roman Empire. There is no democracy. So the only language they know to speak of a reality as a dominion was the Greek word basileia, the kingdom. But many biblical scholars today encourage us to translate that word basileia from Greek to English as a presence, or maybe even the realm of God. Now, imagine replacing the word kingdom with the presence in all the gospel stories. Doesn't it make much more sense? The presence of God is like a woman who found a precious coin under her bed. And then she went shopping on Black Friday and became very happy. The presence of God is what Jesus is talking about when he says the kingdom of God. He encourages us to experience God's presence here and now, to be responsible for that kingdom i.e., the presence of God in our midst. It is not about the armies, it is not about the absolute power of the monarch, but it is about serving each other and recognizing the presence of God in each other. And so, even though we have this very awkward feast day of Christ the King in our hands, remember, it's not about the king or the queen, but it is about the presence of God in your life and the presence of God in the life of each single sister and brother of yours.